Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Namaskar friends. I, Dr. Kishan Joshi, welcome you all to this video lecture session on finite and non-finite clauses, Unit 11, Paper 2. Friends, in this video lecture, we are going to discuss a few important points: clause, finite clause, its definition and types of finite clause; non-finite clause, its definition and types of non-finite clauses. So friends, let's begin the session. Grammarians and linguists point out two basic units that combine words for use in sentences. Phrases are groups like noun phrase, prepositional phrase, verb phrase, adjective phrase, and adverbial phrases. These groups of words are used in sentences, but they do not themselves have the internal structure of sentence. A noun phrase has a noun plus all kinds of other things like determiners, adjectives, nouns, and many other things. Unlike a clause, a noun phrase doesn't have a subject and a predicate structure. Traditional grammar identifies sentences based on structure of clauses in three different ways: simple, complex, and compound clauses. A clause is considered a major unit when a sentence is analyzed scientifically. Clauses can be primarily divided into two different parts: dependent clause and independent clause. The clause that can stand alone is called an independent clause, and the rest are dependent clauses. A simple sentence consists of an independent clause. The significance of the verb in a clause is not only seen in determining its structure in terms of the element which constitute it, but also it identifying and defining two types of clauses according to the form and presence of the verb in that particular clause. So friends, let's discuss clauses in detail. A clause is a string of words which expresses a preposition, and moreover it typically has at least a verb. For example, David sings. Yesterday we visited Canterbury. So in both the sentences we have verbs. A sentence may consist one or more clauses. A sentence may have one or more clauses. For example, she retired early because she was ill. The aforementioned sentence contains two clauses: a matrix, that is also called main clause, and for example, she retired early becomes the main clause, and the subordinate clause becomes she was ill because she was ill, so that becomes the subordinate clause. In linguistics, clauses are divided into two parts: finite and non-finite. A finite clause usually contains a subject and a finite verb. Finite verb which is marked for tense, person, and number. It can be either dependent or independent clause. In contrast, non-finite clause is formed with a non-finite verb, a verbal element which is not marked for tense, person, or number. Non-finite clauses are always dependent or embedded, since a main clause must have a finite verb. A finite verb is a verb that is marked for tense, person, or number, while a non-finite verb can be defined as it doesn't indicate any of these things. For instance, before sleeping you have to brush your teeth. In this example, have here indicates present tense, so it's a finite verb. In the same sentence, sleeping doesn't indicate any tense, so it's it can be considered as non-finite verb. So before sleeping is a non-finite subordinate clause, while you have to brush your teeth becomes a main clause which usually contains finite verb. So now let's discuss finite clauses. The general term finite is related to its everyday sense, that is limited. I am talking about meaning of finite. A finite verb is characteristically limited with respect to person and number, which is usually marked for person and tense. A finite clause includes a primary verb, a verb that can be identified for tense, person and sometimes number, and includes a subject. Finite clauses must contain a verb which shows tense. They can be a main clause or subordinate clause. A finite clause is an independent clause which can serve as a stand-alone clause in a sentence. For example, Ruskin raises his hand constantly. This is the main clause, or we can call it matrix clause. Talking about a coordinate clause, he raises his hand constantly and he talks in class. Here, he talks in class is a coordinate clause. A subordinate clause, for example, Ruskin raised his hand so that he could ask a question. Here, he could ask a question is a subordinate finite clause. A supplementary clause, Ruskin likes the teacher's attention, so he raises his hand constantly. He raises his hand constantly above in the above sentence is a supplementary finite clause. Some different types of finite clauses are: a finite clause is one which has a finite verb, as we have discussed before, which agrees with subject, because verb has to agree with subject, and usually has a subject. There are 5 types of finite clauses. Number 1, simple finite clause. Here in simple finite clause, these clauses are most common clauses in English sentences. A plain sentence consisting a single simple finite clause. For example, the cricket team is traveling to India. So this sentence becomes a simple finite clause. I like dessert. That is the another example for this. The second type of clause is simple finite with coordinator. Finite clauses often function as adjunct in a clause specifying some circumstances of the clause. They usually have a connector at front signaling the relation to the main clause. For example, I left because she cooks badly. I like dessert because it tastes sweet. The third type of clause is relative clause. A relative clause appears as a post modifier to a noun phrase. For example, the man that I saw, the car that Mary likes. Relative clauses differ from WH clauses. They function only as a post modifier of a noun phrase, while the WH nominal clause cannot function in the same way. In most cases, that can be used instead of WH pronoun. The man that came to dinner, the man who came to dinner. Fourth, WH nominal clause. WH nominal clauses generally function as subject, object or complement in a sentence, usually replacing reported speech without explicit detail. For example, what you told is wrong. Here, what is subject? I know what you told. Here, what is object? It is what he told. Here, what is complement? And the last finite clause is that clause. A that clause is a finite clause fronted by that and which represents a fact being presented to the addressee. Most typically, they appear as subject or object in a verbal or mental process. For example, that she is bold is known by many. Here, that is subject. Mary told him that she was not going. Here, that is object. Now, let's discuss some non-finite clauses. A non-finite clause contains a verb which does not show tense, which means it does not show the time at which something happened, or we usually understand the time referred to from the context of the main clause. A finite clause includes a secondary verb, a verb not inflected for tense, a verb that has no connection with person or number, and occasionally subject, maybe. A non-finite clause is a dependent clause formed with a non-finite verb, which can serve as a subject. For example, discussing in class is encouraged. A verbal complement, for example, Bond likes discussing current affairs. A prepositional complement, for example, Bond is used to discussing current affairs. A noun complement, for example, Ruskin, encouraged by his friends, discussed well. Here, different types of noun clauses are as follow. Number 1, two infinite clauses. In this type of clause, the verb comes after the word. The to infinitive is the base form of the verb, or we can also call it a root form, which is preceded by to. So, to always comes before a particular verb. It may also include the perfect, progressive and passive. Two infinite clauses are easy to recognize because they have an infinitive verb form following to. I am talking about root form, base form. For example, I want to give you a present. Here it is simple and active. He seems to have left. Here perfect, I am talking about form. Sally appears to be doing well. It is progressive in nature. She wants to be given more responsibility. Here it is passive. Second, present participle clause, ing clause I am talking about. In this clause, the verb ending ing is used. A non-finite gerund clause has an ing verb form, that is secondary verb. This structure is also known as gerund phrase in traditional grammar. Now, gerund participle is a merged term from the ing form that has multiple functions. Before becoming a bank robber, he was a police officer. Sitting quietly, Tina read the fictional trilogy. Kate remembers breaking the dish. The third is past participle clause. In this clause, the past participle form of the verb is used. A non-finite participle clause usually has an ed or en verb form. Secondary verb I am talking about. Participle clauses mostly occur as noun complements. To recognize ed participle clauses, we need to remember that an ed participle, ed that is past participle form, does not always end in ed. This is because some verbs are irregular. My friends, you know that. There are a number of verbs which are irregular. In order to make verbs past participle in nature, in form, we always do not have to add ed form at the end, suffix ed. For example, the book given to him was very valuable. Now here give, gave, given. So given is a past participle in the before sentence that I have read out. The children annoyed with Bond complained to the teacher. Here annoyed. They will replace the dish broken by Kate. Here also break, broke, broken. So friends, that was all about finite and non-finite clauses. If I need to add something more into what we have discussed, I request you to first have some practice about identifying parts of speech in sentence. You need to practice more about how to identify parts of speech in particular sentence. Now, for that you will have to practice more. After that, if you can easily recognize that in order to identify a particular sentence, you must know some of the elements of sentence in a better way. Now, as long as elements of sentences are concerned, I would like to draw your attention to some elements. For example, with elements of sentence, I would like to share that we need to learn how to identify subject, verb, object, complement and adverbials or adjuncts. Most of the time people also call them adjuncts. So the more practice you will have about recognizing all these elements of sentence, identifying clauses will be far more easy for you. As we have discussed before in the same lecture, that when we talk about grammar, the basic unit, a complete unit I am talking about clauses. Once again, to give a kind of a recap, is clause is nothing but a complete unit of a sentence. Okay, so a sentence can be basically divided into subject and predicate. So the moment you can recognize the verb, the before part of the particular sentence will be the subject part and the following part of the sentence will be a predicate part. So that is once again a very important task that you can do. Apart from all these things, there are certain tasks as part of your this unit 11 paper 2. So you can have more practice about finite clauses and non-finite clauses, and the more you will practice analyzing sentences, maybe single sentences or in a paragraph, the more you will be able to identify whether the sentence is simple, compound or complex, will make your understanding about finite and non-finite clauses more. a few things more about how to learn to identify finite and non-finite clauses. We need to learn some of the connectors, because as we have said, main clause, independent clause, main clause, subordinate clause and coordinate clauses. So main clause will appear in a sentence with maybe coordinate clauses, maybe subordinate clauses along with main clauses. Two main clauses joined with one particular connector will be coordinate clauses in one single sentence. An important thing to remember is, in each and every sentence you will have one important verb that has connection with subject. So that is something very important thing. These are a few things that we need to take care the moment we prepare ourselves to enter into learning sentence structures, finite clauses, non-finite clauses. So friends, that was all about this video lecture session. Goodbye for now and best of luck for future. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you friends. See you again in another video lecture in the next session. Thank you.
स्वाध्यायः